Eleanor Marsh felt the room's eyes reach her a full breath before she heard the door, and she did not look up from her wine until the silence told her why he was standing in it. She would remember it longest, afterward, the way his glove stopped halfway to the footman's tray, the way Mrs. Araminta-Wren's hand tightened on his sleeve, as if she had felt him go rigid beneath the cloth before anyone else in the room understood why. Julian Ashworth, Earl of Rothend, had come to Alderney House to dine on nothing more than duty and a borrowed smile, and instead he had found his wife seated at the Duke's right hand, with her condition no longer a thing any cut of gown could disguise. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. He only stood there, hat half given and half kept, while the 8 weeks since Michaelmas was named began, silently, to count themselves down behind his eyes. Had she known that morning what the evening would cost her, she would have come to the table all the same, because by then she had already spent so much to sit where she was sitting that turning back would have wasted it. The Duke of Alderney, who had known her father before either of them had gray in their hair, set down his own glass with the unhurried patience of a man used to rooms falling silent around him, and said only, "Rothend, you are later than your note promised and earlier than your face expected." It was, Eleanor thought, the kindest thing anyone had said all evening, because it gave Julian somewhere to put his eyes besides her. Mrs. Wren, to her credit, did not flinch from the stairs now swinging toward her like a compass needle finding north. She merely inclined her head to the table at large, as though she had walked into other people's storms before, and knew the trick of standing still in them. Nan Coates, hovering near the sideboard in her housekeeper's blacks with a face like a shut ledger, caught Eleanor's eye across the room and gave the smallest shake of her head, which meant, as it had meant since Eleanor was a girl of 9 losing her mother, do not say the first thing that comes to you. Eleanor did not. She folded her hands over the small, undeniable weight beneath her table napkin, and she waited, because waiting was the only art she had ever been permitted to practice without being accused of ambition for it. The county would call it a scandal by Thursday and a tragedy by Sunday, and by the time it reached the coaching inns 2 parishes over it would have grown a duel in it that had never happened, and none of that, she understood even then, would be as strange as the truth sitting quietly beneath all of it, waiting its own turn to be produced. 9 weeks remained until the trust deed was read at Rothend, until the clause old Lord Ashworth had written in grief and suspicion 20 years before would ask, in its flat legal language, whether his son had a lawful wife and an heir presumptive settled, or whether the stewardship of 4,000 acres and the roof over 100 tenant families would pass instead to a cousin's line that had never planted so much as a hedge. Julian knew the number of weeks. He had known it every morning since the clause had been read aloud to him by his cousin Rosalind Kestrel, who had a gift for delivering catastrophe in the gentlest voice in any room. He knew it now. Watching his wife's hand rest where it rested, and doing the arithmetic that any man might do, and arriving, as he was meant to arrive, at entirely the wrong sum. He had married her a year and some months before, for reasons that had made no sense to anyone at Rothend but the 2 of them, and this was itself a fact worth setting down before the rest, because a courtship conducted almost entirely in ledgers is easily misremembered as cold. Eleanor Marsh had come to Rothend Hall as her late father's daughter, and nothing grander, a solicitor's orphan with a trunk of his old account books and a habit, inherited along with them, of finding the crooked line in a column of honest ones. Julian had first noticed her not across a ballroom, but across his own steward's desk, where she had been brought in, at 19, to help untangle a season's worth of tenant rents that no one else in the house could make agree with themselves. Numbers do not lie, she had told him then, squaring the papers corner to corner before she would say another word. Only the hands that write them. It was her father's saying, worn smooth as a coin from years of handling, and Julian had liked it enough to repeat it back to her, months later, the evening he asked her to marry him in the estate office rather than the garden. Because the garden, he said, was for men who had something pretty to offer, and he had only ever had his accounts to show her honestly. She had laughed, which she did rarely, and never for show, and told him that was the finest proposal she had ever priced, and he had asked, with the particular gravity of a man who did not trust his own good fortune, whether she meant to accept it or merely appraise it. She had married him 3 weeks later in a church half empty of anyone who mattered to the county and entirely full of the people who mattered to her, and for the better part of a year Rothend Hall had been, against every prediction made about it, a happy house. Rosalind Kestrel had lived in that house a great deal longer than Eleanor had, first as old Lord Ashworth's ward, and then, after his death, as the cousin who ran its keys and its kitchens and, increasingly, its books, because Julian trusted family before he trusted strangers, and had never thought to ask why his cousin's hand shook so slightly whenever the quarter accounts came due. It was Eleanor's own competence that had first drawn the two women into collision, in the unglamorous manner of two people reaching for the same drawer, and it was in that drawer, in the spring before the story properly begins, that Eleanor had found the first line that did not agree with itself. She said nothing of it that night at Alderney, because there was, by then, a great deal she had learned to say nothing of, and because Julian had already turned from the doorway and was crossing the room toward her table with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who intends to be seen not hurrying. Lady Rothend, he said, and the title landed in the room like a dropped plate, because everyone present understood it was no longer strictly true, and equally understood he had chosen to use it anyway. I did not know you dined with His Grace. I did not know you dined at all these days, Eleanor said, given how thin the gossip has made you sound. A ripple went round the table that might, in a warmer house, have been laughter. Julian's jaw did the thing it always did when he was refusing to give a room the satisfaction of his temper, a small tightening she had once found forbidding, and had learned, slowly, to read as the opposite. You look well, he said, which was not what he meant, and both of them knew it. And Mrs. Wren, beside him, studied her wine with the particular attention of a woman who has decided this conversation is not hers to referee. I am well, Eleanor said. I have been well kept. She did not say by whom, and let the silence around the table fill in whatever ugliness it pleased, because the truth was not hers to spend in a dining room full of people who would only misprice it. The Duke, watching this exchange with the mild interest of a man who has adjudicated worse disputes over smaller dinners, tapped his cane once against the leg of his chair, a habit of his that meant, in the private language he and Eleanor had built over months of ledgers and long evenings, enough, come, he said to the table generally. Let us eat, before the fish forgets it was ever fresh, and leave the county's business to the county, which will manage it badly whether we help or not. It was not forgiveness, and it was not explanation, but it was mercy of a kind, and Eleanor took it the way she had learned to take most things offered to her since spring, gratefully, and without asking what it would later cost the one who gave it. Julian did not stay for the fish. He excused himself within the half hour, correctly, coldly, and Eleanor watched him go with the particular stillness she had practiced for a year now, the stillness of a woman keeping her own weather off her face while a room full of strangers waited to see it break. It did not break. She had grown expert, in her exile, at the art of not breaking where she could be seen, and it was only afterward, in the small room the Duke had given her under his roof, with Nan brushing out her hair and saying nothing at all, that she allowed herself the one tear she had budgeted for the evening and no more. The private duel came 2 mornings later, on Julian's own initiative, which surprised no one who knew him and would have surprised everyone who only thought they did. He arrived at Alderney House on the pretext of a boundary dispute concerning a strip of common land neither estate had troubled itself over in a decade, and was shown, by a footman who had clearly been warned what was coming, into the small library where Eleanor kept the Duke's accounts spread across a table like a second, quieter kind of company. She did not rise. "You've chosen a poor excuse," she said, before he had properly crossed the threshold. "That hedge has not been disputed since your grandfather's time. I did not come about the hedge." "No," she agreed, and turned a page, though her eyes did not move across it. "You came to look at me and decide what you're owed." He shut the door behind him with more care than the moment required, the particular care of a man handling something he is afraid of breaking, and stood with his hat in both hands as though he had forgotten what hats were for. "I am owed an explanation," he said. "You left my house in April without a letter, without a word to my face, and I find you in October at another man's table, carrying—" He stopped himself, and the stopping told her more than the sentence would have. "I am not carrying another man's anything," Eleanor said. "I would have thought a man who kept his own ledgers so carefully might do the arithmetic before he did the accusing." "Then do it for me," Julian said, and his voice, for the first time since the doorway at Alderney, cracked its composure just enough to let something raw show through the seam. "Because I have done it every way I know, Eleanor, and every sum I run brings me back to the same April, and the same empty room, and no note but the one Rosalind brought me saying, you had gone to be settled somewhere more comfortable than my name could make you." It was the first Eleanor had heard of any note, and something in her went very still and very cold. The stillness of a woman recognizing a lie by its shape before she has yet seen its face. "There was a letter?" she said. "Rosalind read it to me herself. She said you had asked her to spare me the scene of delivering it in person." "I asked her nothing," Eleanor said. "I wrote you nothing. I left because I was told, and shown enough proof to believe it, that staying would ruin you faster than going ever could, and I have spent every week since trying to find the string that would let me pull the lie back out of the fabric without unraveling you along with it." Julian's hand closed slowly into a fist at his side and opened again, the old habit she had once mistaken for anger and had come, in a year of marriage, to recognize as a man holding himself in place. "Ruin me how?" he said. "I cannot tell you yet," Eleanor said, and watched the words cost him something new, a fresh wound laid neatly over the old one. "Not because I do not trust you with it. Because the moment I say it aloud without proof in my hand, it becomes exactly the kind of accusation that will be believed of me and disbelieved of her, and I have already lost enough this year that I do not care to lose the last chance of being believed at all." He looked at her a long moment, the way he had once looked at a column of figures he suspected of hiding something, patient and unwilling to be the first to move. "There is a name for a wife who keeps secrets from her husband to protect him," he said finally. "There is also one for a husband who married a keeper of accounts and never once thought to ask why the accounts near him kept coming out wrong," Eleanor said, and that, at last, put something in his face she recognized, not anger, but the particular grief of a proud man realizing he has been careless with the one thing he swore to guard best. Rosalind Kestrel heard of the Alderney dinner before the ink of the county's gossip had properly dried, because she made it her particular business to hear everything at Rothend a full day before anyone thought to tell her formally. She received the news in her small sitting room with her usual composure, touching the single pearl at her throat as she listened, a gesture so habitual that no one in the house had ever thought to read it as anything but vanity. Poor Julian, she said to her brother Gerald, who had arrived that week under the vague pretext of the shooting, and the rather less vague pretext of watching how the Michaelmas clause might finally settle in his own favor. Dining across a table from her condition, in front of half the county. It is almost cruelty to make him witness it. You sound sorry for him, Gerald said, adjusting his cuffs, a small, precise motion he performed whenever he wished to seem unbothered by a conversation that bothered him a great deal. I am sorry for the estate, Rosalind said. 9 weeks, Gerald. If he cannot present a lawful wife and a settled heir by the reading, the trust falls to you. And I would rather see it fall to you clean than watch him drag his name through one more season of this. It would be a mercy, truly, if he simply let her go and married properly before Michaelmas. She said it so gently, so reasonably, that Gerald, who had known his sister since her cradle and still could not always tell when she was building something out of other people's grief, nearly missed the particular weight she laid on properly. It was, in its way, a soft threat delivered in the gentlest voice in the room, aimed not at Julian directly, but at the shape of the future she meant to arrange around him, and Gerald, watching her smooth her skirt with the same unhurried hand she used for everything, felt for the first time in months a small, cold doubt he did not yet have the courage to name. At Alderney, meanwhile, the world did what worlds do with a scandal too interesting to leave alone. It called, it wagered, it wrote letters full of concern that were really letters full of appetite. Eleanor bore it the way she had learned to bear most things that year, by keeping her hands busy, and it was in the keeping of her hands busy over the Duke's ledgers, 3 days after Julian's visit, that she found the second thread of the thing that would eventually unravel Rosalind Kestrel entirely. A tenant payment recorded in the Duke's own steward's hand for a parcel of land the Duke had purchased from Rothend 2 years before did not match the sum she remembered from Rothend's books the spring she had first gone looking for the crooked line. The ink was the same peculiar iron black she had seen before, thinned with something that dulled its shine at the edges, a mixing she had only ever seen in one hand at Rothend. She sat very still over the page for a long moment, the way a woman sits still over a letter she has been dreading and has finally been given permission to open, and then she called for Nan and told her, quietly, to fetch her father's old ledger down from the trunk in the attic, the one with the brass corners, because she thought, at last, she had found the loose thread that would let her begin to pull. Julian came again within the week, this time without the excuse of a hedge, and found her at the same table with the same lamp burning low beside her, though now the Duke's steward's book lay open beside a second, older volume she had not shown anyone yet. "You look," he said from the doorway, "like a woman who has found something." "I have found several somethings," she said, "and I do not yet know which ones I am permitted to say aloud." He came and sat across from her without being asked, which was new, and picked up a stray pen and turned it over in his hands the way he had once turned over betrothal rings he was too nervous to give her outright, back when they were courting across this very kind of table. "Teach me then," he said. "Not the somethings. The reading. Show me how you find the crooked line, so that when you are ready to say it aloud, I will already know how to believe you." It was, Eleanor thought, the nearest thing to an apology he had yet managed, and she found she wanted, badly, to give him something in return. So she showed him, the watermark held to the lamp, the particular slant of a 7 that betrayed a hand trying to disguise itself as another hand, the way real ink dried duller at the stroke's end, while borrowed confidence always left a small, telling shine. He watched her fingers rather than the page more often than he watched the page, and once, when Nan came in to ask about the coal and delivered, in the same breath, a remark so dry about gentlemen who could not tell a debit from a duck. Julian laughed, not the polite exhale he had given rooms for a year, but a real, startled bark of a laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised the two women watching him produce it. Nan reported it to the kitchen before the hour was out, as though she had witnessed a comet. Eleanor said nothing of what it meant to her, only smoothed the corner of her father's ledger with her thumb, an old habit of her own, and said, "There, now you have seen the trick of it. The rest is only patience." "I have never lacked patience," Julian said, "only information." "Then I will trade you information for patience," she said, a little at a time, "until I have enough of one to spend all of the other," and it was, though neither of them called it so aloud, the nearest thing to a bargain struck on stated terms that either of them had managed since April, feelings disclaimed and present, in every word regardless. The blow, when it came dressed as kindness, which was Rosalind's particular gift. She called at Alderney House herself, alone, in a bonnet chosen for its unthreatening blue, and asked to see Eleanor with the air of a woman performing an unpleasant duty out of pure family feeling. "I thought you ought to hear it from me before you heard it elsewhere," she said, once the door was shut and Nan had been sent, unwillingly, from the room. "There is talk, Eleanor, of the sums His Grace has been paying into an account at the Alderney Bank these past months, sums that match, rather too neatly, the timing of your arrival here." Eleanor's hands went still over the page in front of her, though her face did not. "His Grace pays me a salary for keeping his books," she said, "as any employer pays any clerk." "Of course," Rosalind said, touching the pearl at her throat, "though I confess I do not know many clerks paid quite so generously, nor many employers quite so devoted to defending a clerk's reputation at his own dinner table. People will say what people say. I only thought you would rather arm yourself before the saying reached Julian's ears twisted into something worse. It was, on its surface, a warning offered in friendship, and it was, underneath, a blade laid precisely along the one seam Eleanor could not yet defend, because the truth of the Duke's generosity was bound up with the very forgery she had not yet finished proving, and to explain one without the other was to hand Rosalind exactly the confusion she had come to plant. "Thank you for the warning," Eleanor said, evenly, though something in her chest had gone the particular cold of a woman watching her own rescue turned, in someone else's hands, into a rope to hang her with. The fallout arrived within days, in the form of a letter from Julian, cold and correct and utterly unlike the man who had laughed in her library over a duck joke, informing her that until the matter of the Duke's payments was satisfactorily explained, he thought it best they not meet, for both their sakes and the child's. Eleanor read it twice, standing very straight, the way she had learned to stand when a blow landed somewhere no one else could see it. Rosalind came again 3 days after that, this time with an offer wrapped in the same soft blue bonnet, a sum, generous and specific, deposited quietly in Eleanor's name at a bank 2 counties distant, in exchange for a signed statement releasing all claim on the Rothen name and removing herself, without further scandal, from the county entirely before Michaelmas. "No one need call it anything but a kindness," Rosalind said. "You would want for nothing. The child would want for nothing. And Julian could finally settle the estate as the law requires, cleanly, without this mess hanging over every dinner he is ever asked to attend again." Eleanor looked at the paper a long moment, at the sum written out in a careful, confident hand, and thought of every week since April she had spent proving, penny by penny, that she was not the thing this document assumed her to be. "I will not sign away a name I never once used dishonestly," she said, "for a price that only ever bought your silence and never mine. You would rather have nothing, Rosalind said, and for the first time something sharp showed beneath the softness. I would rather have the truth, Eleanor said, even if it costs me everything this offers. I have priced both, and I know which one I can live inside. Rosalind left with the paper unsigned, and Eleanor sat a long while afterward with her hand pressed flat over her father's ledger, having just refused, at real and visible cost, the easiest exit she would ever be given, and finding, to her own surprise, that the refusal felt less like loss than like the first solid ground she had stood on in months. The darkest hour arrived on its own schedule, the way darkest hours generally do, indifferent to whether anyone is ready. The Duke, pressed by his own trustees and by a rumor now grown teeth, was persuaded to suspend Eleanor's keeping of his accounts pending an inquiry he did not believe in, but could not, in fairness to his own name, refuse to open. She was not turned out. He would not go that far, whatever his trustees urged. But she was, for the first time since April, without work, without proof yet fully assembled, and without a single soul beyond Nan and the Duke's own quiet loyalty standing publicly at her side. Julian did not call. The 9 weeks had become 6, then 4, and Eleanor sat one gray afternoon with her father's ledger open before her and the Duke's forged page beside it, and felt, for the first time in the whole long year, the particular fear of a woman who has done everything correctly and still cannot see the way through. It was Nan who broke the stillness, arriving at a near run with her apron still dusted in flour and a folded paper clutched in one reddened hand. From the clerk, Nan said, without preamble, because preamble was not in her nature. Rothen's man. Pruitt slipped it to the bootboy at the kitchen door like it might bite him. Wouldn't wait for an answer. Eleanor unfolded it with hands that were, for once, not entirely steady, and read a single cramped, ink-stained line asking, in the tone of a man drowning and ashamed to call for help, whether there was still time, before Michaelmas, to undo what he had been made to write. There was time, but not much of it, and what followed was less a plan than a marshalling, the quiet, deliberate gathering of a case the way a woman gathers a harvest she knows will not wait for a second cutting. Eleanor went herself, with Nan beside her for courage and propriety both, to the small rented room where Josiah Pruitt had been living since his conscience had grown too loud for Rothen's servants' hall, and found a man with ink-stained fingers that would not sit still in his lap, who told her, in a voice that broke twice before it finished, that Rosalind Kestrel had been bleeding the estate's accounts for 2 years to cover her brother's gaming debts, and that when Eleanor's own sharp eye had come too near the truth that spring, Rosalind had ordered him to forge both the love letter that had driven her from Rothend and the very payment records now being used to ruin the Duke's name alongside hers. I have her instructions, Pruitt said, and produced, from beneath a loose floorboard, a small packet of letters in Rosalind's own unmistakable hand, each one a careful, damning instruction, written in the belief it would never see daylight. Gerald Kestrel came next, and came on his own feet, arriving at Alderney unannounced one evening with his cuffs, for once, left crooked. To say that he had found, going through his sister's desk in search of nothing more than a misplaced hunting bill, a bank draft from 2 years back that matched, guinea for guinea, a debt he alone had run up and never told her the whole truth of, and that he could no longer pretend not to see what she had done in his name, and would not do so any longer. It was the first hairline crack in Rosalind's composure, though she did not yet know it had opened, and Eleanor, gathering ledger and letters and the testimony of a frightened clerk and a guilt-struck brother into one careful case, sent word at last to Julian, not of forgiveness, which she was not yet ready to promise, but of proof, which she was, at last, ready to produce. The reading of the trust deed took place at Rothend Hall on the appointed quarter day, before the assembled trustees, the family, and a good half of the tenantry who had come, ostensibly, for the customary harvest accounting, and had come, in truth, for the spectacle everyone suspected was coming. The Duke of Alderney stood as the neutral instrument the deed required, his cane tapping once against the floor to call the room to order, and it was into that silence that Eleanor Marsh walked, carrying her father's ledger under one arm and, on the other, nothing but her own steadiness. She did not raise her voice, because she had learned, over a long year, that the truth did not need raising. She laid the old brass-cornered book on the table and opened it to a page marked with a strip of ribbon, and beside it she laid the forged entry from Rothend's own accounts, and held both to the light of the window so the whole room could see what she had seen months before. One ink dulled honestly at the stroke's end, the other borrowed and shining where it should not shine. "A hand can copy a figure," she said, "but it cannot copy the patience it took to earn the ink that wrote it." This entry was written in haste, over a debt that was never Julian's, to cover a sum that was never mine. She called Josiah Pruitt forward, and it was the Duke himself, in his unhurried, patient voice, who asked the one precise question the whole case had been built to survive. "Who instructed you to write the letter that sent Lady Rothend from this house?" and watched the clerk's ink-stained hands finally still as the answer left him, plain and public and impossible to unsay. Rosalind's composure, so carefully built over years, did not shatter loudly. It simply went, all at once, the way a dam goes when the last stone finally shifts. And what came after was not the venom the room half expected, but something smaller and sadder, a woman admitting, in a voice gone suddenly young, that she had spent 20 years watching Julian be loved first, and chosen first, and forgiven first, and had told herself, for just as long, that she was only ever protecting the family, when in truth she had only ever been protecting her own old, unhealed place at the edge of it. Gerald did not defend her, but he did not gloat either. He stood very still, cuffs crooked, and let his own testimony stand as the final weight that settled the matter beyond appeal. It was Julian, in the end, who spoke the mercy, standing over his cousin's bowed head with a stillness Eleanor had once mistaken for coldness, and now understood as its opposite. "You will have an allowance," he said, "and passage abroad, and my silence on the particulars, not because you have earned kindness, but because Gerald has, and my tenants have, and I will not spend either of their futures paying for your ruin twice over." Rosalind wept then, finally, not for herself alone, and the room, which had come for spectacle, found itself instead witnessing something closer to grief, and let her go from it without another word thrown after her. What came after the tribunal came slowly, the way warmth returns to a room once a storm has finally passed through it. Julian found Eleanor in the estate office 3 evenings later, the same room he had once proposed in rather than the garden, and set on the desk between them the small worn coin of a saying she had given him a year before. "Numbers do not lie," he said, "only the hands that write them. I have done the sum honestly this time, Eleanor, without anyone else's ink in the column, and it comes out the same every way I run it. I am asking you to marry me again, properly, in the church, in front of everyone who is too eager to believe the forged version, not because Michaelmas requires a wife, and not because a child requires a name, but because I want you, and I will take you only if you want it exactly as freely. Take what is freely given, or take nothing at all," Eleanor said, handing the old bargain back to him transformed, and found that she meant it entirely. The wedding, when it came in the first cold week of November, was small by design, held in the same half-empty, well-loved church as the first, with Nan weeping openly through the whole of it and blowing her nose on a handkerchief she had embroidered, badly, for the occasion. Gerald stood witness, steady now, and was given, in the months that followed, the running of a smaller family property that let him build something honestly his own. Josiah Pruitt kept his place at Rothend, his hands finally still. Trusted at last with figures no one needed to check twice, Mrs. Wren, released from the shadow play of her borrowed scandal, married a quiet clergyman the following spring and sent Eleanor, every Michaelmas after, a jar of her own preserved plums by way of thanks. The Duke of Alderney stood godfather to the child born that winter. A daughter with her father's stillness and her mother's sharp eye for a crooked line, and taught her, as soon as she could hold a pen, to tap her small hand once against the table whenever she wanted a room to listen. Rosalind, from her quiet rooms abroad, wrote once a year, brief and correct, and was answered in kind. Because mercy, once given, is generally easier to keep giving than to take back. A full year turned, heat to storm to harvest to frost, and round again to a warmer one, and on an evening very like the one that had begun it all, Julian Ashworth stood once more in the doorway of a small dining room, hat half raised toward a waiting footman, and stopped, not frozen this time, but simply still. Watching his wife across the candlelight with their daughter asleep against her shoulder and a robin, absurdly, still singing outside the glass long past its hour. Because a robin, as Eleanor liked to say, does not sing for anyone, it only sings, and is glad of any who happen to be listening. If this story warmed you the way an old ledger warms in the hand of someone who finally understands its figures, come sit by the fire a while longer before you go. Keep the kettle on, keep a chair by the hearth, and tell me in the comments which line stayed with you longest, the door that was never locked, or the ledger that finally told the truth. Stay close, subscribe if you'd like a place kept warm for the next story. And until then, be patient with the crooked lines in the people you love. Sometimes it is only ever another hand's forgery, waiting on someone steady enough to hold it to the light.